Now we are trying to scan the horizon for new ideas and for new challenges and for new chances. We will hear 4 very different talks that give us insights on the financial sector and how biodiversity is not compatible with the financial sector, on the question of convivialism, of finding a new relationship to nature, on zero carbon building, which we actually do need. The talk will be about Africa, but I can assure you we do need this in Germany too, and especially in the city of Hamburg. And we will also talk on the perspective of young people, and we hear young people, the young UN youth delegate from Austria, to give us his ideas on biodiversity. So we will hear 4 talks, 20 minutes each, and take 10 minutes of time for your questions. So please send us your questions. Use the chat. I think almost everybody of you knows how to do this, and I try to take as many questions as possible. So we are ready to start for the first talk by Marc Chesney. He says the current financial sector is incompatible with biodiversity protection. And well, seeing the long numbers of red lists and the warning of IPBES of 1 million species on the brink of extinction, we can only agree with him, but of course we don't want to stop here. So Marc Chesney, being a professor of quantitative finance at Zurich University, and also being the chair of Center of Competence for Sustainable Finance, having also done research in Paris, being an both an economist and a mathematician, we are really curious what you are going to tell us about this incompatibility, because in the sustainability bubble, there is a lot of hope that sustainable finance will be the solution to many of these problems that we are actually causing right now. We're looking forward to your talk, and I hope you can give us some hope in the end of your Marc Chesney, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I think you can see my slides, I think.
I can see it.
Perfect.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So yes, the main message of my presentation is that the current financial sector is incompatible with biodiversity protection. We are confronted with huge greenwashing activities, and we have to be aware of that. That's the main issue in a nutshell. So here, the structure of my presentation, I will start with some global financial figures, just for us to understand quickly the context. I will focus on the financial and social imbalances, because there is no solution to the environmental issues without solution to the social imbalances. The two issues are connected. I will consider one example. I live in Switzerland, so the case of Credit Suisse in terms of greenwashing activities. But it's just an example. It's true unfortunately, for most of the big banks worldwide. I will give an example of a toxic financial product. I will address the issue of nature as capital. Is it the solution? No. I'm convinced that it is not the solution. And then I will conclude, if possible, everything in 20 minutes. Okay, so here, global features. In blue, you see global GDP. More than $80,000 billion until 2020. In orange, you see global debt, private and public debt together, everything together. What can we observe? Before the start of the COVID, global debt corresponded to around 300% of global GDP. Last year, it was 365%. So in other words, the debt level increases faster than the GDP level. The main paradigm in economics is the following: increase debt in order to generate growth, and try to generate growth in order to reimburse part of the debt. It does not work. It's not ideology. As we can see here, the debt level increases faster than the GDP level. So we need new paradigms. We need to think out of the box. In this situation, it's obvious that some companies or even some countries will be confronted to default. They will not be able to reimburse the debt or all the debt levels. And in this context, there are bets that you see in green, so-called derivative products in finance, A small minority of these products is useful in order to hedge against these default problems, but the large majority is linked to bets on, again, the default of companies or countries. Talking about growth and GDP, so what students learn in economics today is that always more is supposed to be equivalent to always better. And that's what they keep learning in Germany, in Switzerland, in France, in the US. But it's precisely the cause of our problems. They should learn another word, not always more, but what is sufficient, to live in a nice way. What is sufficient? But so they learn as if it was in physics that always more means for them always better. It's simply, in most of the cases, it's wrong. It might be true in some cases, but it's not always true. I talked already about this issue, debt and growth. Then as soon as we talk about growth, there are three questions: for whom, at which cost, and for which purpose. So here I mention the ONG Oxfam. 82% of the wealth generated, so in 2017, went to the richest 1% of the global population, etc. Economic growth today means an increasing pollutions, increasing CO2 emissions, etc., etc. Decrease of biodiversity levels. We should be aware of that. And again, as explained previously, instead of focusing on always more, the idea should be to focus on what is sufficient or necessary in order to live in a nice way. Talking about these bets that appear here in this graph, the green part, you see these bets, these so-called derivative products, correspond, according to the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, based in Basel, in Switzerland, around 8 times in green, 8 times the global GDP. Now, if you focus on a specific country like Switzerland, you get the data from the Swiss exchange. And here, so it may be small, but you see somewhere, let me check, it's quite small, equity, derivatives on equity, this long number here. So derivatives used in Switzerland, meaning for Swiss and foreign institutions active in Switzerland and for their clients abroad. And you see a number which is slightly more than 18 million of billions of Swiss francs. 18 million of billions of Swiss francs. What does it mean precisely? It corresponds to around 50,000 times the size of the Swiss GDP. 50,000 times the size of the Swiss GDP. How could it be the case? So again, a small minority of these products corresponds to hedging products. Again, financial risk, fine. But the large majority corresponds to bets. And it's dangerous because it could be a bomb. It could explode. We don't know where these bets are, for which bank. It could be BlackRock, Switzerland. We don't know which hedge fund, which bank. We don't know. It's a black box. And when it explodes, the taxpayer pays the bill. So obviously, it's not compatible with the protection with biodiversity protection. It's obvious. It's a kind of casino economy. Now, talking about social aspects. So here you see the income distribution worldwide. What do we see? Nothing. Why? You can see an horizontal part here, and for 0.0001% of the population, a vertical part. I wrote here $3 billion per year. It could be 4, it could be 5, it could be 10. The result is the same. This situation is not compatible with democracy, just to be clear. 50% of the population has to survive with less than $5.5 per day. And you have here a very small group of people who can buy media companies like us a piece of bread. That's dangerous for democracy. Let me give you an example of who is here. Mr. Bezos, just an example, it could be Elon Musk. He, on July 20th, in 2020, his wealth increased by $13 billion. I didn't say million, I said $1 billion. Do you know what it represents in one day? it represents something like 2 times what 1.3 billion Africans received the same day. It corresponds also to around 10 times the castle of Versailles, close to Paris. Louis XVI was probably the richest person worldwide. He had this nice castle, and it corresponded to, it was built in 50 years. In the case of Mr. Bezos, it's 1 year. 1 year for this castle. So we have to be aware of that. Social inequalities are extreme. So there's a group of people. They live in, they use mega yachts or super jets. Do you know how much it costs? How much costs a full tank of a mega yacht? It costs around $1 million, a full tank. And the fuel is burned off at a rate of around 1,000 liters per hour. And the same people last year went to Glasgow. This year they go to Sharm el Sheikh with a private jet, and they explain us how we should live and decrease our emissions. We have to be aware then so let's talk about the billionaires, for example, around 2,500 people. Their CO2 emissions correspond at least to 30% of the total emissions worldwide. So 2,500 people, their emissions correspond to at least 30% of the total. When Mr. Musk, Elon Musk, or Mr. Bezos, if they go to the moon, if it's possible in the future over the weekend or for 1 week, you can imagine the CO2 emissions. Now, let me take the case of Credit Suisse and of greenwashing activities. Again, I'm not going to focus only on Credit Suisse, but here, for the sake of clarity, it might be easier. There were many scandals. So let me start with a statement of the former CEO of Credit Suisse, so last year, in the sustainability report. Our new group strategy puts sustainability at the core of our value proposition, our firm belief that such a focus is central to long-term growth for our clients and ourselves. We are committed to helping our clients in the transition to a lower carbon future. Perfect. Now, there is a long list of sustainability networks and initiatives for Credit Suisse, 3 pages on my slides. As you can see, Credit Suisse actively participates in a number of sustainability networks and initiatives worldwide. So, Carbon Disclosure Project, Equator Principles, you name it, Global Impact Investing Network, Principle for Responsible Investment, almost everything is here. Swiss Sustainable Finance, UK Impact Investing Institute, everything. So it seems to be convincing, but at the end of the day, it's not convincing at all. If you read first, if you are informed about these bets, these derivatives, you will see. Had a look on the yearly report of Credit Suisse. The derivatives, all these bets on possible defaults, correspond to only for Credit Suisse to 22 times the size of the balance sheet, and around 25 times the size of the Swiss GDP. Credit Suisse is too big to fail, so meaning that if there is a problem, the taxpayer will pay the bill. Talking about now compensation schemes, starting with Mr. Brady Dugan, he was a CEO of Credit Suisse during 2007 and 2014. He received around 160 million Swiss francs. And during the same time, during these 8 years, the stock price decreased of, guess what, 70%. Good deal. It's a good deal for this kind of work. Mr. Thiam, who was CEO during 4 years and a half, received around 64 million Swiss francs, and the stock price of Credit Suisse decreased of around 40%. I guess you are aware of the scandals associated to Credit Suisse. Last year, here a few media information in the media. Credit Suisse shareholders seek removal of risk chief after twin scandals. You might remember with Archegos, with Greensill, all these hedge funds. Credit Suisse was involved in Bulgaria. Credit Suisse found guilty in cocaine, cash laundering case, etc. Uh, is it really green? Is it sustainability or is it a joke? And then talking about the recent events. So last year, the CEO received 3.8 million Swiss francs despite all these scandals. And last but not least, vast loans are granted by this bank to companies that emit greenhouse gases, where in particular in the Arctic, Credit Suisse, like many other banks, supposedly green, gives loan to companies active in the Arctic. They look for oil, for gas, etc. If you're interested, I will answer my emails. Now, what is new today is the so-called shadow banking sector. So what does it mean? It means financial institutions which are not banks, like, for example, BlackRock. BlackRock is not a bank. Hedge funds, they are not a bank, etc. They have a very strong power. Now, let me give you briefly an example of a toxic financial product. Briefly, very briefly, in a few minutes, a so-called CDS, a credit default swap. If you Google, you will find this definition. A CDS is a derivative product that allows its owner to protect himself against the risk of default of a reference entity. Maybe it's not clear. So here I have a graph. Let me assume that the bank gives a loan to a company, maybe 10 million Swiss francs. And let me assume that this loan was given in 2019, just before COVID. And let me assume that the company is active in tourism, hotel, restaurants, who knows. And so the bank might fear in 2020, 21 that the company will not be able to reimburse its loan and might buy a CDS. A CDS usually is on $10 million, in my example, on 10 million Swiss francs. So here it makes sense. The bank buys a CDS from an insurance company. And if the company here is unable to reimburse the 10 million Swiss francs to the bank, but will reimburse only 3 million, for example, then the bank will activate its CDS and will receive from the insurance company the difference, 7 million Swiss francs. So far, so good. It's useful. Now, there is a small comment usually associated with these products. It's not necessary to actually be exposed to the reference entity's risk in order to enter into a CDS contract. So what does it mean? It means that you don't need to be exposed to risk in order to hedge. But if you are not exposed to risk, why should you be allowed to hedge? So at the end of the day, it's not a hedge, it's a bet. So let me take the example of cars. It would mean for cars that even if you don't own a car, you would be allowed to buy a car insurance. But what would it mean? It's forbidden everywhere worldwide. It would mean that you will look for the bad neighbor, maybe, who drives very poorly, and you will buy a so-called car insurance on his car, but it would not be a car insurance, it would be a bet on the accident. And you might be motivated. You might be motivated to manipulate his car in order to make sure that he or she will have an accident. It's forbidden everywhere worldwide. Otherwise, we would have many more accidents. It's obvious. And but in terms of financial products, it's not forbidden today. So here, allow me to move forward with this example. Now, let's assume that the bank, instead of buying one CDS on 10 million Swiss francs, will buy many more CDSs, maybe 10 CDSs, so on 100 million Swiss francs. Why should the bank hedge against a possible loss of 100 million Swiss francs? The maximum loss corresponds to the loan, 10 million Swiss francs. Allow me at this stage to compare two different scenarios. Scenario number one, the company will reimburse the loan to the bank, and the bank will receive 10 million Swiss francs. Scenario number two, the company is under financial distress and will give back only 3 million Swiss francs, for example. Then the bank will activate its 10 CDSs and will receive 10 times the difference, 10 times 7, 70. So in a nutshell, the bank will receive much more, when its client is under financial distress. It's a nonsense. And here, so if I follow the logic, another bank will enter this game, and despite not having given any loans to the company, will buy CDSs on the company. At the end of the day, one of these institutions might go bankrupt, and the taxpayer, we will pay the bill if this institution is too big to fail. Is this realistic? Unfortunately, yes. Here we had Lehman Brothers in 2008. Which companies sold all these products? AIG in the US. Which banks purchased these products? Partially, Goldman Sachs. And it's still the case today. So despite thousand and thousand pages of regulation, for cars, we need 2 sentences, not thousand pages of regulations. Very simple. If you own a car, you have to buy one and only one car insurance. Second sentence, you are not allowed to buy a so-called car insurance on somebody else, and that's it. I'm almost done. Some people pretend that to consider nature as capital is the solution. So to put a price on everything. Because if you are a trained economist, you think that the solution is growth or creating new markets. CO2 markets, for example. They don't function, they don't work, because we don't observe a decrease in CO2 emissions. But create new markets. New markets will mean new commissions for specific financial institutions. That's not a solution, that's a problem. Nature is much more than capital. It's not possible to measure all the losses, all the biodiversity losses in dollars. What does it mean? Can we put a value on a specific species? What does it mean also? And why not on us, human beings also? So to put a price on animal species is absurd. Finally, the main issue is that what has value has no price. And I say that as an economist. My last slide. So we are confronted with the bankruptcy of a system of casino finance, and casino finance is not compatible with the protection of biodiversity. It can't be both. It can't be both. Banks have to choose either finance casino or green, being sustainable. This situation creates systemic risks. Net zero emission in 2050 is a joke. It should be now. So the main issue is that big banks should stop to give loans to companies active in the oil, gas, and coal industry as soon as possible, not in 2050. They should stop the new contracts, the new loans as soon as possible, next year, for example. Thank you for your attention.
So much. We have a million questions, I guess. I start with two in the chats, but I ask you to also give us the hope, a slight hope of
Yes,
change by telling us how to fix this. But let's start with two questions of Volker. He said in the very beginning you compared GDP and debt, and he said, wouldn't it be better to compare debt to human-produced and natural capital also?
How do you measure natural capital? So I don't want to open this box because we will not need 10 minutes, but a few days. So GDP is simple. I mean, we know how to measure GDP. It's already done. My point is that nature is much more than capital. So as soon as we open this box, it's a never-ending story.
Sure. Okay. And the next question was regarding Mr. Bezos. Volker wrote that, of course, you're right, but he said we have to see the other side. Many people are profiting from his companies, so that's why he's so rich. I mean, there was this process of everybody of us making him even richer.
I'm not sure, but it should be discussed also. I'm not sure that it is the case that some people profit, but it generates, at the end of the day, social inequalities are too high worldwide. So it's a problem. Now, in terms of hope, again, the idea is not to be depressive after this presentation. There are solutions, obviously. So when we're in contact with the banks, we have to push. We have to ask them, when will you stop giving loans to these companies, again, active in oil, in gas, in coal? That's the main issue, as soon as possible. What is going on in the Arctic? What is going on in Amazonia? Which company finance these activities? What about Uganda with Total? We have to be aware of that and push in the right direction. We as citizens, not only as professors, not only as academics, we are citizens. There are solutions, obviously, but we should not wait and accept net zero in 2050 because it won't work.
I think I fully agree because I've heard so many talks of the Potsdam Institute of Climate Change, and they are telling us this very, very clearly. And we journalists remain in a very difficult situation as we see the incompatibility between what climate science says and what is happening. Again, Volker, he is not yet content with the question of climate natural of measuring natural capital, and I don't know whether we can fix this in 3 minutes, but he says Martin Quas in the lecture before, he has explained how to measure natural capital, and of course there were many studies, as the TEEP study also, and I know that people who worked for this said we don't want to put price tags on everything. As we know, nature has a very intrinsic value that must not be put a price tag on, but they wanted to introduce this into an economic system so that companies have to pay for destroying the value of nature, even if it's not measured in a perfect way. Do you have can you follow this path, or would you say the bank system needs a complete fix then?
No, I don't follow this path. Just to be clear, it's a mistake. So I'm not going to address this issue. To put a price on nature is a mistake, because what is the basic idea? As soon as the price is put on nature, the idea is to trade, to open new markets. So if a company destroys, let's say Total in Uganda, for example, destroys natures there, okay, then Total might have the obligation to create, to recreate something for new species. Let's say in Ecuador. What does it mean? Who will check what Total does in Ecuador? It's a joke. We have to be aware of that. So I'm not going to follow this path because I'm convinced that it is a mistake.
Mm-hmm. So, but your solution, is it like giving rights to nature and giving nature an intrinsic right to defend its own existence in the case of, let's say, a new mining extraction site in wherever it is in the world, or what would be your solution?
The solution is to stop new mining extractions. It should be forbidden. I mean, it contradicts what has been signed and ratified by most of the countries, by the way. How could it be the case that, again, to take the example of Total what is allowed to exploit huge fields in Uganda over the next years? 100,000 people will have to leave their home where they live. It destroys nature. What does it mean? So it should be stopped. And to put a price on nature is not the solution, it's a problem.
Okay. I see the extraction case, but I don't see where politicians should be able to stop this, because they are dependent on voters who are also consumers, who are very much used to get the profit from all this extraction because they are used to their current way of living, which depends on extraction. So it's...
Yes, but we're used also to rely on fresh air and clean water. Sure. And maybe even if we receive dividends in 50 years, if we cannot have access to fresh air, we will die. So the priority is fresh air and clean water, not dividends.
I actually do agree. I don't see who has the power to change this disastrous systems, but I hope you'll find a solution. And I'm very much looking for it. And I'm suggesting, Volker, maybe you can organize a discussion between Martin Quas about nature capital and measuring it, and also Marc Chesney, who says it's not worth measuring it because he's so much aware of greenwashing and of the broken sides of our financial system, being someone who studies this system. Marc Chesney, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
You have to leave the hotel room.
No, 10 minutes.
10 minutes. We have 10 minutes to go.
Thank you.
We go to the next talk of our morning, even though, of course, being confronted with the corruption of the system and having heard this so clearly, it means we all have to think about taking action even more than we did before. So Volker has already said we go into more detailed discussion. I'm really, really looking forward to the outcome. So let's In the beginning, I said I'm looking for some hope, and I still am. And the next title is very, very compromising and looking forward to hope. It says saving biodiversity in a world on fire towards a convivial alternative. And Professor Bram Büscher is going to tell us about convivialism, which even sounds like living together with nature and not against it and destroying and extracting it. He is professor for sociology of development and change at Wageningen University and research in the Netherlands. He's also a visiting professor at the Department of Geography, Environmental Management, and Energy Studies at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and author of many books with great promising titles as The Conservation Revolution, Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene. And also the last one that appeared 2 years ago is called The Truth About Nature Environmentalism in the Era of Post-Truth Politics and Platform Capitalism. And I actually feel I have to read this. Thank you so much for joining our conference, Bram. We are very interested in your hope, the hope that you can give us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tanya. I really appreciate it. Thank you also to Volker and to Catherine and others for the invitation. I hope I'm audible. There were some things with my computer, and I restarted it just before this talk. So I think
we can hear you very well. That's everything is fine with the
okay.
technique.
Let's hope it stays that way. So yeah, saving biodiversity in a world on fire. I'm delighted to be able to present here in this conference. I've been able to get in and out of several sessions and listen to some of the earlier keynotes. So I think these discussions are incredibly important, and discussions, of course, we need to be having. And I think some interesting solutions and ideas we're presenting going forward. I've also seen some discussions where I feel some of the problematic elements of biodiversity and conservation thinking are still very much present. And so I would want to reflect on that. And I think very much sort of taking this forward from what Marc Chesney was saying. I think, he's spot on. I listened to Martin Quas about natural capital as well, but I've studied this for 20 years. I've actually done research on, studying on natural capital, and have also, like Marc, come to the conclusion that that's not the way forward. So I don't want to spend too much time on all of that, because I think others are better at explaining the problems. What I'm particularly interested in is how we're seeing the rhetoric around biodiversity, but of course, more generally, environmental issues getting stronger and more hectic. Literally 2 days ago or 3 days ago, our United Nations chief says we're on a highway to climate hell. I mean, to talk about strong language, but this is becoming nothing new. It's becoming the new normal. Every new report that's coming out, right? Living Planet report a couple of weeks ago, code red for the planet. Further back, IPBES, scientists talking about biological annihilation. It's very clear that we need to change course, right? Because we're in a code red situation, rhetoric and warnings getting stronger and stronger. And it's actually, I find it a bit sad. Every new report, it's almost becoming, something you can in advance sort of see that they are trying to up their game, and at the same time trying to remain hopeful in a way, in the face of the fact that business as usual is not sustainable. The conservation sector and people thinking about biodiversity, I think, can contribute massively to this. They have a lot of power, but they really also need to change their thinking, because mainstream conservation, as we argue, myself and many colleagues, has not been an antidote to this. Not saying that it not had any impact. It has saved species from extinction, imported ecosystems from destruction, but overall, it has not made the change over the last 100 years that we need to see, of course, to get out of the extinction crisis. So just to show that in a couple of graphs, and how we've, how conservation thinking sort of is in line with the problems that we see. With a growth-based economy, exactly like Marc was saying, right? You can expect, many things to follow, what we've seen over the last 50 to 70 years, according to the Anthropocene Great Acceleration graphs, whereby lots of different socioeconomic trends, Earth system trends are going up, be it paper production, fertilizer consumption, GDP, ocean acidification, nitrogen, shrimp, even shrimp agriculture, all following these kind of hockey stick graphs. So in that sense, growth is working, right? We've seen incredible growth over the last 50 to 70 years, and even over the last 200 years. So growth is working, but at the same time also leading to the familiar problems that have been pointed out. And interestingly, we see the same, graphs when it comes to extinction. Not surprisingly, right? This is from the article that also talks about biological annihilation. But the exact same issues we can see in terms of conservation solutions. But before I get that, I just wanted to show this slide when we're talking about climate change. Of course, again, the same thing. And this one particularly hit me, right? That with every major international agreement or IPCC assessment, we've continued the journey towards further CO2 emissions. And if we continue, with the solutions that are currently on the table, I will bet, I'm not a betting person, but you can guarantee that this will go up further. There's absolutely no indication whatsoever at present that with the current solutions in place that we will hold this. And the same goes for conservation, as I said. So here's a slide that shows the same hockey stick graph, right? The growth of protected areas across the world, both terrestrial and ocean protected areas, sea protected areas, and the cumulative total, whereby we see that over the last 100 years we've moved from almost 0% of the Earth protected to about 17-80% now, and we need to go to 30% by 2030, of course. But my key point here is that we have been doing, we've been growing the protected area state over the last 100 years very successfully, at the very same time that we've seen the intensification of the biodiversity crisis, right? So the extinction crisis has risen in exactly the same time as we've seen the rise of protected areas. So protected areas may work, obviously, to save some species, but they have not worked to halt the extinction crisis. Quite the opposite. They've gone hand in hand. And then coming to the point that was mentioned in the discussion before, will business and natural capital thinking, accounting for biodiversity, then change the equation? Again, I don't think so. Here I don't have the same hockey stick graph, but I think you can actually make the exact same hockey stick graph for a couple of reasons. First of all, because all these ideas about the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, the natural capital coalition, all kinds of other initiatives around biodiversity, investing, finance issues for biodiversity, etc., are presented as something new, but they are not new, and they're not new at all. If you delve into the history of biodiversity conservation, particularly in the United States, and here are just two books that I can highly recommend: Vanishing America and The Rise of the American Conservation Movement by Dorceta Taylor. Both of them and many others also show that business and biodiversity conservation have been integrated from the start of mainstream conservation. They've never been separate, right? That they have seen a certain intensification whereby, the same people that were responsible for, making sure that we have the growth economy are also those that provide solutions for the biodiversity crisis in the same language, in the same logic of growth and capital. And it's come to the point that, I believe we are seeing an absolute contradiction whereby nature and capital are now literally becoming one in the idea of natural capital. And many people also here in Wageningen University, and I'm sure Martin Quaas and many others are doing incredible work. It's very difficult to measure, natural capital. But I've studied this for 20 years. I've studied biodiversity ecologists studying, natural capital, trying to, it doesn't work. It literally doesn't work. And I'm not saying that it can't save some nature here or there, but it's way too complicated. You can't actually take into account the emergent interactions, ecosystem interactions, and put in any way a measure on that. And second of all, or third, I mean, it also doesn't work in relation to keeping everything, growing at the same time, right? We need to radically degrow oil and all the other things in order to be able to grow, our natural capital estate. So if that's not happening, then measuring natural capital, which is, I think, impossible, will also certainly not make a difference, unfortunately. So this is just some background from, I think a lot of evidence that we've seen over the last 100 years. But I also want to look forward. How can we move beyond this? Right, we are seeing incredibly intense debates around all of this. We're seeing these same solutions, right? 30 by 30, protected areas, natural capital in the CBD discussions. But I don't necessarily, I'm very critical of that, but at the same time, I also see a little bit of light there at the end of the tunnel, in the sense that many of these discussions are actually talking about the things that we do need to be talking about. Perhaps a bit differently, I would say, but nonetheless, they are talking about two key systemic dimensions that are critically important in relation to biodiversity. On the one hand, the relation between nature and people, and on the other hand, the relation between biodiversity and our current system of capitalist-induced economic growth. And if you reflect on that in terms of bigger conservation debates, what we call the Anthropocene conservation debates, we do see some very interesting trends and dynamics, including a trend towards perhaps more radical debates and changes within the conservation and biodiversity ecological communities. So what we argue in our book, The Conservation Revolution, which has very recently been translated into German, so it's now available as Die Naturschutzrevolution as well. And we're very, very excited about that, to also get these debates, or at least contribute to these debates in the German-speaking world, where these debates are already, being held and are very important. So what we argue, if we look back at the big conservation debates, is that we see four big different paradigms, three currently existing and one that we propose going forward. So mainstream conservation around protected areas, around natural capital business approaches, are very much in what we hear across these two axes in the top left corner, right? They've banked on protected areas, separating nature and people, and have never really, critically tried to move beyond the system of economic growth induced by capitalism. Now, new conservationists and some natural capital approaches have tried to move beyond this separation. And we think that is an interesting phenomenon. Some have been actually quite critical about ideas about wilderness and all that, but still very much within the current system of capitalism. And in fact, they married the two into one, right? Natural capital. Now, this has received a huge critique, amongst others, by Professor E.O. Wilson and others, that have said, this kind of moving beyond protected areas is not realistic. We need to go back to that. Of course, his famous book, Half Earth, said we need to protect half the planet. And this is this has morphed into the 30 by 30 approach, protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. But at the same time, many within the broader community here have also become quite critical of growth and of consumerism, and the fact that we do not appreciate the intrinsic value of nature so much anymore when we instrumentalize it and make it all utilitarian. So these are very, very big discussions and broad debates, and I'm not being very nuanced here, but I don't have the time for that. In our book, we go into extreme detail about the nuances and the exceptions and the interesting discussions. But if you zoom out and you look at the whole debate from this sort of simplified perspective, what we conclude is that there have been interesting, radical discussions within the broader conservation community. They are talking about the things that we need to be talking about. They are also pointing at new directions, but they're contradictory. We believe you can't go beyond separating nature and people within the system of capitalism that depends on exactly this separation and alienation by turning everything into a market product. And you can't, just protect half the planet 50 by 50 or 30 by 30, without huge socioeconomic costs. But you also can't go beyond growth through just focusing on protected areas. You somehow need to marry the two in a new way. And this is what we have been trying to think through with our suggested idea of convivial conservation as an alternative paradigm. So basically what we're arguing is that the dominant conservation perspectives that we're seeing now are interesting, but do not go to the roots of the problem because they don't actually take the history of capitalist political economy seriously enough, and so fail to present a coherent system or systemic alternative. Right? I would, again, predict that if we continue down this road, and the CBD seems to be continuing down this road, the graphs that I showed earlier will not change at all, unfortunately. And I find this incredibly sad. At the same time, I also want to tap into this radical potential, right? The fact that so many people do see the need for radical change, including many people in the discussions that we've seen in this conference. I think we all agree on that. And so we need to think about what could that be? How can we do justice to these radical impulses, but in that sense also move beyond them to present a coherent, broader alternative? This is what we've also tried to do in the book in relation to and in discussion with many other movements, ideas. You see just some of them here that we feel are struggling with the same issues, but from different entry points. So for us, convivial conservation is an intertwined strategy beyond growth, beyond the nature-people dichotomy. It's beyond growth because, Einstein said it best, right? You cannot solve the problem with the same logic that created it. If you keep the same logic, you will keep the same graphs as we showed in the beginning. And clearly that's unsustainable. But we also need to go beyond the nature-people dichotomy, beyond separating people and nature, and beyond protected areas. Because we can't save biodiversity if we can't live with it. We can't offset it. We can't just continue to do what we want and think that somebody else somewhere in the world will then save nature for us. There's no space for that. And there's also not the responsibility that we all need to show, right, in our daily lives, in the way we construct society, in the way we construct our economy, in order to be able to come to a more sustainable overall picture. So that for us is how we frame convivial conservation more broadly. And in doing so, we're trying to think really focused on conservation and on biodiversity. How can we then change this within that broader framework of other alternatives like the donut economy, degrowth, what other people are also talking about, convivialism, etc. But when you zoom in on conservation, we believe that several long-term but also short-term actions may be helpful for thinking through an alternative. So if we want to move beyond the boundaries of protected areas, we must first move away from that name altogether. We want to protect nature from ourselves. If we can't trust ourselves, and we are also nature, we are part of nature, then something is very, very wrong, right? We need to move from protected to promoted areas, we argue, which are places that are re-embedded in the social, ecological, but also political and economic broader environment. And this is a process, right? We don't say this must happen overnight, but we must see how can we use these areas, currently protected areas, to think through other ways, right? Other types of economies, other ways to make sure they're not just exclusive, just for tourism and all that, but how can they be re-embedded so that nature can live, more freely beyond these areas, but we can also be part of that in new and more sustainable ways. So this is rethinking protected areas. The second is we must, again, moving beyond the dichotomy, right? Not just think about saving nature, non-human nature. No, human natures and non-human natures are intrinsically connected. They are relational. The way we think about ourselves also relates to how we think about non-human nature, and vice versa. We can't just think about nature, or human nature, as Homo economicus, which is the dominant idea of human nature these days, and think that which has led to the growth problems, and think that can then save non-human nature. So no, we need to actually rethink what it means to be human, right? That we don't have to be these in control, crazy emailing, efficient people, but we can be different kind of humans, in a different kind of system that thinks differently about non-human natures. And so these two for us go together over the long term. And a lot of people I saw in interesting presentations are already doing that. Third, we can't bank on tourism, right? Tourism is increasingly part of the problem. People flying across the world to somehow save nature doesn't, leads to further climate change issues, obviously, but also creates a lot of problems with, voyeurism. People flying across the world to quickly see that, get their tick box lists going. We need a very different way in which we actually interact with and pay for visiting nature. So we would argue for slower, longer-term engaged visitation, right, rather than touristic voyeurism. Fourthly, we can't just focus on spectacular nature somewhere in Africa outside. No, we must focus on everyday inside natures that are all around us, right? Not just the big animals, but also the small ecosystemic relations that we actually live with and care about those, right? Which brings us from this big idea of conservation to taking it to everyday life and everyday society. And lastly, it is not, big experts that know a lot about nature that will make the difference, unfortunately. And I find this one of the most interesting things about conservation, that often people that study nature in detail somehow are the key people, right, to think through what is an inherently social and political, right, form of governance, right, conservation. We need that. Of course, we need biological, ecological knowledge. That's critically important. But we need broader common democratic engagement, broader common democratic governance, right, whereby different voices come together to think through what it means to do conservation. This is the long term. In the short term, we have some, very concrete actions. It must start with historic reparations and decolonization. That's practical and the first starting point. Conservation has too often, been funded by the global north, which still where about 90% of conservation funding comes from, very much focused on the global south, with too little global south voices being central in this. That must absolutely change. Second, we would say that, basic income discussions are important. They are problematic in some way, but they can help maybe to push for different types of, local economies based in competition and resource extraction, to new types of economies focused on care, as the figure shows, so that people have, a basic way of living. We must rethink corporations in the state, what it means to do business, what it means to run, a government. We must, conservationists and biodiversity of ecologists must really also think their relations with corporations in the state. They've enabled, the way that they work in this growth-focused manner, I think, too much, and must make clearer distinctions. Should we be working with everybody in that same way? We don't think so. Fourthly, we think networks of people coming together to really think through these things more deeply is necessary. We call it a convivial conservation coalition, but other words are, other labels are of course also fine. And then translate that into actual landscapes, democratic governance mechanisms, and new redistributive finance mechanisms. Good. I'm
Bram,
coming to the end.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. I see Tanya.
Yeah, got it. I just was asking that we are running out of time. I at least take
I'm
one
sorry.
question.
Okay.
So
I'm sorry.
your concluding thoughts.
I need to come to an end. But I am coming literally 2 quick slides. I think mainstream conservation is in a bit of an existential crisis, but I do see a very likely further intensification towards more protected areas, more natural capital, more knowledge productions around all of this, and especially also more technology. These have all developed tremendously over the last decades in line with the growth of the problem, and will not get us out unless we rethink the broader context within which they function. And that means pushing for post-growth and post-capitalist transformations. I don't see any other way going forward. Structural transformation, necessarily post-growth, which is, I think, very liberating. It's realistic. In that process, we must deal with power, time, strategically, long-term, short-term, and different actors and how they function within the system. And we believe that convivial conservation may be one of those ways in which to bring these things together into, a convivial alternative. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
And we all look forward to reading your books. Thank you so much. I take 2 questions in almost no time, but this is necessary. Sophie Peter said, "Thank you for the presentation. Besides economy, changes in the growth would also lead to need restructuring of our public system, like growth is needed to keep the economy running, the state running, etc. Is that also part of your book, or do you need sources around this discussion?"
Thanks, Sophie. I mean, that's a fantastic question. I sort of hinted at that, when I said about rethinking the state, rethinking the public sector, right? We see a lot of public financing of private, business, and many public systems have started functioning like private sector organizations, right? Including the university. And we need to really rethink that. And I would actually appreciate sources. So if you want to send it to me or put it in the chat, it is part of our book to a small degree. But again, we don't have the solution. We want to be part of discussions around broader solutions. We do suggestions, but I think this is one area that is really, really critically important. So I would certainly appreciate your, those sources you talk about.
We need a discussion, most definitely, on this, also with Marc Chesney. Volker wants to know how about the implementation gap. So how to implement these changes. And of course, I see this problem too, because there are a lot of people who don't want to stop the current system because they are making profit in the old sense with it. And they use their economic power to make pressure on a political system. So we have to be really strong in developing our ideas to overcome these powers, I think.
Yeah.
Any ideas on that?
Volker, thank you so much. I mean, absolutely critical. So one thing that conservation has done is to try to, if I put it bluntly, is sort of like you get the crumbs of the table of where the power lies, rather than building alternative power, right? So we don't believe that big conservation organizations need to just work with everybody. No, you need to have some principles, unless you really want to move towards a more structural system, right? We rather build alternative institutions, alternative networks to build counter forms of power. That is absolutely critically necessary. And the longer we wait with that, the more problematic things will become. That's hard. It's very, very difficult, but that's the only realistic way in which change has ever worked. And in fact, how, those who are currently powerful have built up their power historically in the first place. So how can the propositions be implemented? Regulations, democratic processes. I mean, for me, it is all of the above, right? It is regulation plays an incredibly important role, but the state itself also needs to rethink its role, like what I think Sophie was also talking about. It's not all that hard. I mean, we can make this all very difficult. I think Marc also said it quite nicely. Like, some things you can just forbid. I mean, this happened during the COVID crisis. Many of us have already forgotten this, but when something really dramatic happens, all of a sudden, all kinds of things become possible that before that were absolutely completely impossible. There's money all of a sudden available, like not just a little bit of money, right? Billions is available all of a sudden to help companies to do this, that, or the other, right? So there's on the short term, very clearly, Volker, cut all the subsidies to harmful activities, all of them. They can be done tomorrow, literally, without any hesitation. Put that into building alternative institutions that actually allow us to understand how we can live with biodiversity, that rethink protected areas, and that build different types of communities and forms of economic interaction that are more sustainable for the long term. Just my 2 cents. There's much more, but we can start, and we can start now, and we must push for that.
Maybe we should start with creating the desire of having this convivialist future, which might be so much more agreeable than the world actually we're living in, and all the threats we are facing that are getting bigger from one day to another. Thank you so much, Bram. Yeah, thank you so much for this great inspiration. And well, let's hope when we meet the next time, this process will have already started. And I think there are a lot of people working on that. So thank you so much, Bram. That was really, really inspiring. We're going to have a look at another solution, not comprising the whole world as the last two the speeches we have heard about the global financial system and the global crisis we are in, but we are going to now we're going to listen to a good solution to the question of how to build houses for millions of people, as there is a big growth of population, especially in Africa. And if Africans are going to build houses with concrete and cement, as we have done this, they will follow our mistakes and make the global problems even bigger. So here is a German entrepreneur and impact investor who has introduced green construction technologies to sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, there have been these technologies before for many centuries, but then the construction with very extractive materials has started in Africa too. And here is the solution for this problem by an asset manager and a corporate finance expert, and also an expert in strategic planning, who took all his expertise to found a company in Africa to build houses and to replace the impact intensive building with new ideas. Let's now listen to Eckardt Dauck. And he should switch on his camera right now. I'm really looking forward to see you. Eckardt Dauck, are you there in our... there you are. Welcome. Great relief. Well, great to see you. The floor is yours.
The kind introduction, and yes, thank you for the invitation. Professor Büscher just said it's not all about Africa and the big animals, and I agree. But I will nevertheless now speak a little bit about Africa. You said it's the other problems are global, have a global view on global issues. I think the construction industry is also a global issue. It's responsible for somewhere between buildings are responsible for somewhere between 35 and 40% of global CO2 emissions, and we need to make a difference there. The reason why I'm here today is really because in 2009 we as a family had a discussion, and the question was really, what difference can we as a family make? And we decided to focus on environmental protection and housing in developing countries. So this is how it all started. The title today is Zero Carbon Buildings with Straw, a Sustainable Solution for Africa and Beyond, ! And you will see towards the end of my short presentation here why it is not a question mark, but an exclamation mark. And when I talk about straw, I mean all kinds of building materials from renewable resources, if it's timber or hemp or other materials, other plants. So my focus again on the construction industry in East Africa, specifically Uganda, and then I will touch briefly on Germany and the rest of the world. I will now try. I don't have a very elaborate presentation, but I will try to share my screen and hope. Please take care. Yeah, so some of the underlying issues in East Africa are the rapid population growth, rapid urbanization, and also the growth of refugee settlements. And that's where we are active. All this results in a very high demand for new construction. And that obviously has a very negative impact on the environment, biodiversity, and our climate, because sustainability didn't play a big role. Historically, the buildings were quite sustainable. They built with earth blocks, with grass on the roofs, and reed and timber. But nowadays, most of it is concrete and burnt bricks. So the consequences of this are massive construction and fast growth of the cities, including megacities. We are expecting cities with population over 50 million in the next 50 years. And 60%, this is an interesting number, 60% of the buildings that will be required in the region there by 2060 have not yet been built. So it's a massive project, and we all need to do something and support so that these cities will be built more sustainable. And that also includes, obviously, the operational phase when it comes to energy, waste management, water, and so on. And we are now also focusing on that a little bit with other partners together. And I will say something about that later. Do you have the slideshow?
There we go.
There we are.
Yes, so this slide, this picture was taken in northern Uganda in a refugee settlement where we have about 500,000 refugees, mainly out of Sudan, South Sudan, Congo, and so on. And I will come to that. That's where we are quite active at the moment, together with some international NGOs. So currently, when you look at the materials that are being used, they are very bad for the climate, for the environment, and biodiversity. They include concrete, which is the second most consumed material in the world after water. And burnt bricks, low quality, so-called roadside bricks that are produced everywhere. People just dig a hole in the ground, get the clay, and cut down trees. Obviously, don't replant the trees and burn the bricks. And they are so low quality when it comes to tensile strength or strength, and also the size, that a lot of mortar has to be used to actually build with them. And the cement in the mortar is the most expensive part of the construction. The bricks basically cost nothing, no cost for the timber to burn them, no cost for the clay, and $1 a day per person who works there. So that's why it's still a very affordable way to build, and that's why also a lot of international NGOs still build a lot of their projects with these roadside bricks. there is now a change in the approach, but a lot of them have never thought about it. All they thought about is, oh, there are lots of people working locally, and they earn some money, and not about the effect on the environment, really. So our approach is to introduce alternative sustainable building materials and circular construction technologies. And I want to stress that it's not just about one solution. It's really trying to be a catalyst to bring together a lot of different solutions that make sense in that local environment. And what we are now doing is we replace concrete, steel, and bricks as much as possible with material based on locally available raw materials, for instance, straw. There are large rice farms, for instance, and wheat farms, and the straw is being burned at the end of the season. So it's not being used, and it pollutes the atmosphere. So we use straw, we use FSC certified timber. That was not easy to find that, but it's starting now that companies are starting to certify the production process and replant and manage properly. And we use recycled materials, for instance, recycled plastic and lightweight steel frames, which are from 60% recycled steel. And with this, we replace structural parts that are currently made from reinforced concrete, for instance. We also work together with the German Federal Institute for Material Research and Testing, the BAM, here in Berlin, on something called bioconcrete. I think that word is a bit misleading, but the reason why it's called bioconcrete is because part of the cement is being replaced with either cassava or rice husk ash, and that can be about 25%, and makes it thereby a little bit more friendly. We can't get around using concrete in foundations, for instance, at the moment. And that's why we are trying to find solutions there as well to reduce the impact. At the same time, it then creates local value chains. So the rice husk ash, for instance, we get by talking to the farmers. They sell the rice husk to schools, for instance, to cook their meals, and we then buy the ash and add it to the concrete. And that is one. And that includes supply of raw materials. So the farmers in Rwanda, for instance, we had about 2,000 smallholder farmers delivering their straw to us and getting paid for it, straw that they burned before. That includes the construction of buildings, the fabrication of building materials, and the planning and design. All that is done locally. And that obviously means also that we need to focus on skills development. And that's what we've done for the last 12 years. We are training planners, architects, engineers, how to use and how to plan with these new materials or materials that they are not familiar with. And it's the same with the contractors, construction workers, and graduates at the university. So it has been quite a journey for us since 2011 when we started the first project in Addis Ababa. And I will, this is it. It's a 2-story building, and it was implemented together with the Bauhaus University in Weimar and the ETH Zurich, and also the EIABC, the university in Addis. So we started with research and development to come up with construction technologies based on the straw board that I will show you a bit later. The product has been available for 80 years, so it was not a new product. We knew it lasts for decades, and it was just the applications that we've looked at to use it as a structural element. And this 2-story building has actually no other structural element but these straw boards. No timber, no steel, no concrete. And it was built in 2011. and is being used by the university has been used for the last 10 years. It gets monitored. So even in that environment, and you can see it's a quite basic design, but the whole building, including construction, the cost was about $10,000. And all kinds of recycling we've tried to recycle materials. You can see different finishes on the outside. For instance, the inner tubes of tires that were thrown away were used as a cover on the outside of the facade, and other things. So in 2015, we then developed an affordable housing prototype in Kigali in Rwanda. The project was funded by FUNERVA, that's the Rwandan Fund for the Environment, and the IFOI Institute in Germany has done a life cycle analysis. There they were part of the project, and they also did an analysis of the buildings that we designed and constructed. So the outcome was that the straw panel has actually a negative carbon footprint of about 22 kg per square meter, and the complete building had a zero carbon footprint, not net zero carbon offsetting with any kinds of certificates that people buy, but it's actually, as a building, the CO2 sequestered in the straw board offset the CO2 emitted by the foundations, for instance. In 2018, then we established Impact Building Solution Foundation in Uganda. It's a social enterprise and a design and build developer. We have planning offices with architects and engineers, production facilities for different kinds of building materials, the straw board, interlocking, stabilized earth blocks, timber elements to construct, FSC certified, and so on. You can see now in the slide the production in Uganda of the board. You can see how we build with the board. Is that moving on its own, or are you changing the slides?
Which number do you want now?
No, it's fine. It can be there. That's fine. I was just wondering because I didn't move them forward, but
I was trying to find the right file to what you were saying. And
okay, I can press click on them. It's fine. Yeah. So I go just one back to the production. We have over the last 10 years done numerous testing programs together with a number of university and research institutes, not just regarding structural the structural ability of the board, but also building physique and so on and so on. The construction is actually very easy. You can see here, this is a little health center that we've built. And on the right-hand side, you can see how these modules are being prefabricated in the factory. It's a continuous process, cut to size, and then installed on the building site. So the installation of a building like that takes probably 2 days to install all the walls. So it's fast. We have a certain quality control, which is also an issue when you're building in a refugee camp in northern Uganda. And it's important for our clients as well. We have established strong partnerships with NGOs like Malteser International and family foundations, for which we build these schools and health centers and offices, and now also dwelling units, not only in refugee settlements, but also in cities. These partnerships were really essential to enter the market and to gain acceptance also from the local population. And recently we handed over a small shelter and started to work with local graffiti artists and the local kids in the slums of Kampala. So they came up with this graffiti on the side of one of our houses that we built there and handed over to the Ugandan Skateboard Union. So we are really trying to engage the local community and the children, real focus on the children, so that they understand how they can make a difference when it comes to climate change and biodiversity and environmental protection. We have recently been recognized by several international institutions, including UN Habitat. We participated in a Climate Smart City Challenge that was a worldwide challenge. 4 cities around the world, Bogota, one in Asia, Bristol in the UK, and Kampala in Uganda. We won the 2022 Climate Smart City Challenge for Africa there. Together with 4 partners, we are now planning a neighborhood. And I said earlier, there's more than just the building. This is actually a smart, or supposed to become a smart neighborhood. It's a small model on about 1 hectare, where we look at waste management, recycling, plastic recycling, biogas, water, wastewater, the typologies. So this is in a city context. So 4-story, 5-story, 6-story buildings to have a little bit more density. At the moment, everything is just a single story in this city or in this area there. And the idea is to upscale this once this model neighborhood has been built. We've also just this week been nominated by our former Minister Müller for international cooperation and by the German Senat der Wirtschaft for the German SDG Award 2022, and we will hear next month if we have won or not. So it's now just time to expand a bit about beyond Africa, and we want to do that and make a difference in the developed world. And this is what you see in the developed world. It's mostly concrete. Yes, we have advanced technologies based on renewable materials that are no longer just for niche markets, but can be delivered at scale also. A lot of planning is going on with timber structures. Michael Ramage from Cambridge has designed a 300-meter high tower for London that could be built but will not be built with a timber structure. Partner is just designing 2 towers for here in Germany with 12 stories, and there clearly has to be a change, and there is an opportunity now. We know that real estate development is all about the bottom line and not about the environment, not about the climate, and not about biodiversity. And we've tried it 10 years ago to introduce partition walls that have a negative carbon footprint to replace gypsum board walls. There was no way, because it was a seller's market. Everything got sold, every apartment before it was built, and the marketing people would just say, look, then we have to wait for our money because people want to see the walls from straw first. That has changed, and I think one of the reasons is that there's a risk for investors today that they could lose money in the future. And new frameworks, if they don't build buildings today that are still compliant with requirements in 5 or 10 years. So in that context, I know that we have finance people here, so that when you look at the big funds, there are Article 6 funds. That's the past. Now everyone is talking about Article 8 and Article 9 funds, and that means that the projects have to be in line with ESG standards. And these new frameworks, these like ESG standards, play an important role in the adaptation process. And we really noticed that the start of a fundamental repositioning towards sustainable construction by developers, municipalities, and large real estate investors in the German market. And I think the current crisis, if you will, with interest rates going to 5%. A lot of people and developers are stopping their projects and wait. There will be a change coming. And one big problem that I see are still the approval processes in Germany. We have so many different norms when it comes to concrete, for instance. It's not possible to introduce the bioconcrete that I talked about before here in Germany in the next 10 years. Absolutely not possible. And it's the same when it comes to timber construction and so on. Approval processes are slow. And someone said that before, you know, when we have a pandemic, it's possible to make changes quickly. I think when we look at the building industry, that has to happen too. The good thing about this building that I'm showing you there, it's brand new. It has been built in Hamburg, and we've just started to install straw panel walls in that building. That's also a reason why I am so optimistic that sustainable construction technologies will be adapted, and not just in Germany, but the developed world. And we just want to be a catalyst in this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eckardt. This was just a landing in time to give me the chance to ask you two questions. Indeed, they are both about scaling up. Philip Sprenger wants to know, there are lots of new constructions in Germany. How scalable is your construction approach? And is there interest of investors? You have already mentioned that the finance industry has to change and has to take sustainability more into account, even though we heard very skeptical voices of the finance Prof. Marc Chesney in the morning about how much is this going to change. But anyway, and Volker Moosbrugger also wants to know about scaling up and how to really change this, because we know that the construction industry has a huge impact on biodiversity.
Yes. So I agree. The finance industry will not change without pressure, but things like SDG frameworks and standards put pressure on them. And it's I think in the Netherlands they are the first office buildings that cannot be rented anymore because they don't comply with the standards anymore, and that's not structural standards. And that's why I mentioned these funds. Their main topic at the moment are stranded assets, they call it. They are assets that in 5 or 10 years, apartment blocks or office buildings that don't meet the standards and they can't rent, and they have to spend a lot of money changing things. And then that's why they look at changing now instead of having another expense in 5 or 10 years. But when it comes to scalability, I mean, we can't change the German construction industry single-handedly, and that's why we first focus on partition walls, drywall basically. Yeah, typically here we use a metal frame, and that gets covered with gypsum board. It's not a very environmentally friendly solution. When you look at office buildings, every 5, 6, 7 years, everything gets ripped out and put on a dump because there are new tenants, they want a different layout, and so on. So it's not that it happens once at the beginning and then at the end of life, whatever, when that is, 50 or 100 years, when the building gets demolished, you rip this out. It happens much more often. And that's what we are doing. We have developed solutions that also meet the criteria that are required, for instance, fire rating criteria, where you need 90-minute fire rating between certain rooms, or soundproofing, all that with the straw panel walls. They have been tested, they are approved, and we can start. And as I told you, we've just started in this building in Hamburg. We've just signed up a 12,000 square meter building, new build that is under construction in Cologne. So the complete build out of that office. And the interesting thing was that the developer wanted it, but also the tenant. And in the contract, in the lease contract, it actually says that the walls have to be from straw, because the tenant now says, I want to hire young people. So I want to position our company as a company that cares. And it's very interesting, the development there.
Can I add another question, as we are already running out of time, but I wanted to give you this one from Cecilia Flocco. She says, you mentioned the building before in Africa that actually is a carbon sink because the straw captures all the carbon inside the straw, inside the building for a long time. Is this also valid for these constructions you are planning here? As she says, the transport emissions have to be added. And then we are only talking about the inside walls of straw, right?
In Germany, initially, yes, but we have quite a few well-known German planning offices that are building timber structures that are already working on solutions to use it within the shell, a combination of timber structure with the straw board also in the shell, but that comes later. So at the moment, yes. You asked about scalability. This goes into the same direction. We have about 30 million tons of straw in Germany per year. Of that, about 10 million tons plus minus is available for industrial use. And in Germany, we are building about 40 million square meters of gypsum board wall every year. To replace that, we only need 1 million tons of straw. So 1/10 of the straw that's available. So it is scalable. We will be producing in Germany, so it's local. It will not be transported around the world. And we have, for one of our standard wall designs, we have a negative carbon footprint of 43 kg per square meter of wall.
Can I offer another material for you?
Yes.
As we need a lot of renaturation of peatlands, and farmers who formerly used to do agriculture on it, now they will grow the grasses that grow on peatlands, and the ecologists might know the English words that I lack currently, but they are looking desperately for use for these buildings. So you must be connected with these people because they need to make money from their peatlands, which is for the moment not possible. So I think you have to be connected. Thank you. Paludiculture is the word. And what is the Sägen and Roggen, what that are growing? Thank you for the help from the chat. So we'll talk about paludicultures later. Thank you so much for this inspiration, and also for just doing and changing things. Volker Moosbrugger has talked a lot about the implementation gap in the last days, and you have shown us there is a great way to implement new ideas and to really make a change. So thank you, Eckardt, Dauck, very much for joining this conference, and please enjoy the next talk, as we are going to listen to the perspective of young people. And the UN Youth Delegate from Austria is here. He is a student. Obviously, he is on the advisory board member of the European Youth Parliament, and he also cares about biodiversity. And he'll now give us his view on the questions we have dealt with today and his perspective as a young person on the highway to climate health. Marvin Huber, welcome. Thank you so much for joining. I still can't. Can you switch? Yeah, there you are. Thank you.
Here I am. Yeah, thank you so much. Also, let me start off by saying thank you to the technical support who have been figuring out with me a way where I can hear you, because unfortunately technical difficulties came up. But dear ladies and gentlemen, it's really an honor and pleasure to be here with you today. As already said, my name is Marvin Huber. I am on the advisory board of the European Youth Parliament. The European Youth Parliament is an organization which is very close to my heart, because I've been spending 6 years of my volunteering time, so the last 6 years of my life, with them and in various of their projects, initiatives. And this is what I want to talk to you about today. Generally, when I was invited to give this to give this talk today, I felt a bit nervous, as always, and I thought to myself, okay, what can I tell this room of experts, these people who are like on the forefront of their scientific communities, what can I tell them? And in general, I felt it's important for me to put a spotlight on especially the partnerships that youth and science needs to establish. And that's why my talk or my presentation is called Youth and Science, the Amplifiers of Reasons. And in the next around 15 minutes, I want to give you a plaidoyer of engaging more strongly with young professionals and also just volunteers who are also trying to combat the biodiversity crisis we're facing right now. As you probably know, 50% of our world population is currently under 30, which is just one of the main reasons we need to think now in the living reality of young people as well. And with this, I would kindly, let's see if I can, perfect, yeah. I will give you a quick rundown of what I'm going to talk today about. So first of all, we are here on the horizon scanning, so we really want to focus also on what is out there, what is not just in science, but what young people are also talking about and thinking about when they hear the word biodiversity crisis. And in this regard, I want to first of all focus on the European Youth Parliament, what it is, what it does, and how it is actually establishing educated discussions and active citizenship, and how this is extremely important for young people, and how they are at the forefront also of engaging in this way. Secondly, I want to talk about the role of young people generally when facing the biodiversity crisis. And thirdly, I want to sum up the talk with a call for action and also some inputs on what I and the consultation of some of my fellow volunteers have been coming up with for things and how youth and science could engage in a further manner. So let me start off with, as said, the EUP is a forum of educated discussions, active citizenship. So what is the European Youth Parliament? So generally, the European Youth Parliament is a peer-to-peer organization, which is focused on being an educational programs that brings together young people from across Europe to debate the pressing issues of our time. Let's split this up. Peer-to-peer education program means in the European Youth Parliament that everything is done from youth for youth, obviously peer-to-peer. But it really means that all the events are fully organized by youth. They are fully, the discussions are fully created, researched, and also engaged from young people. And lastly, all of this is also followed through with media. As you know, we're living, and especially the young people are living in a very digitalized and internet-focused time. All of this is summed up and put also out there through youth. So all aspects of the journey of a session, from the very first building blocks and ideas to it being fully implemented, are done by youth. Also, as you can see, young people from across the planet, there is no session in the European Youth Parliament, or roughly, where not around 20% of the participants are not from somewhere in Europe, whilst Europe is also expanded here in this definition. And we're debating the pressing issues of time, which means we're obviously also debating the biodiversity crisis, but we're focusing on things that youth really cares about, because they are implementing and discussing about the things they want to talk about. So with this, our mission is to inspire and empower young people and a generation of informed, open-minded, responsible, and active citizens that shape society and drive impact. I've also got here a graph which shows you the European Youth Parliament in numbers, which I always found fascinating, to be just one individual of so many. There are over 500 events, which are categorized in different levels. So from the very regionalized and the smallest sessions, which have around 80 participants, to a national session where 1 or 2 each year are held in each of the states which contribute to the European Youth Parliament. So there are around 150 participants, to the very large and international sessions, which I'm going to give you an example of further down in the talk, which have the most elaborate plan. They are organized in a very long span, and they are also, with around 200 young participants, really the flagship events of the European Youth Parliament. Furthermore, with this, we managed to engage over 30,000 participants each year, which clearly shows what impact young people are driving with making sure that these conferences, so our events are called sessions, these regional or to the international sphere conferences are held. We are actively involving schools, and we are actively involving volunteers, as I have been, And in this regard, I want to give you a bit of further insight into what we're actually doing in these events. How can we engage with so many people? And is it just that we're sitting down with them and having a quick chat, or is it more constructive? So it's not the first, it's the second. It is a really engaging method, because even at the smallest events, which are 3 days long, there is a specific attention paid to these 4 pillars of a UAP session. The first aspect being, of course, team building. If you're combining and centering 80 young individuals in a certain location which have never seen each other, obviously it's important to spotlight and to make sure that they're forming comprehensive teams. In this team building process, the so-called FIRO circle is used, which makes sure that young people have also been discussing about ethics and their morals. So they're used to a very good discussion culture. And the next step, and the committee work step, the main pillar and working pillar is addressed. Here, young people are involved in trying to summarize one drastic issue at each time, per their main problems and their main solutions. This means that all of this is summed up in a so-called resolution booklet and then put to the General Assembly. In the General Assembly, all young people of the conference come together, and this is now the part which simulates the European Parliament, and discuss if a resolution which addresses the main problems and solutions for a topic in Europe should pass or fail. So generally oriented on the way that the European Parliament works. Lastly, one of the main pillars is also that we're looking at very different cultural programs. So there are evenings or nights or different events on a session, particularly focused on making sure that cultural exchange happens. This obviously fosters a lot for young people. And as you have probably realized, all of this happening in the working language English is alone a testament of how incredibly educational this whole experience for young people is. Looking at the goals of these UAP sessions, one can clearly say that we're here and trying to ensure that participants are comfortable in expressing their own opinion. Living in a time like this, where we're surrounded by multiple opinions coming at us, we want to give our participants the opportunity through educated research to find where they're standing in a topic and what their opinion is, and how they can, with other young individuals, come together and discuss it. They're building intellectual understanding and cooperation, especially in the team building aspect and the committee work aspect. They're encouraging consensus-based decision-making. So it's very basis democratic. One of the most important aspects for me is that in the European Youth Parliament, there is no party affiliation. It is open for everyone to come there and discuss their own opinion. And this really drives a very open and broad-minded peer-to-peer learning experience. The aspect of empowerment and active citizenship is also fostered through various other events which happen next to sessions, but also during events where maybe plenary discussions with a very open panel, and also experts happen. And in general, I've come to realize that for me, the most incredible aspect is that it provides the space and possibility to grow for young people. Just as an example of my UAP career, I have been organizing an event when I was 18 years old, which meant that I was solely responsible for organizing around 5,000 euros, organizing a place to stay over like 4 days for 80 young individuals, making sure that 80 young individuals attend the event, and so on and so forth. Coordinating this and having a secure net behind you, which makes sure that you can fail in the process, but still things go on, and you have the possibility to grow, is of course incredible for young people. And with this, we're really making them active citizens, because they can realize once they have identified a problem, they can go there and discuss it, and they just have to make sure that they're staying on this. With this, I already want to give you an example of the flagship event in 2021, which was the international session Ljubljana, which I attended. And in it, you can see down there on the right a screenshot. As it was the COVID time, we had to switch a lot of our programs to the online realm. In it, a session was realized which took over 3 years of volunteering from some individuals to just coordinate and organize. We had over 200 participants, with participants coming from 35 to 40 different countries. And the whole event lasted over 10 days, which just also shows how dedicated young people are in discussing these issues. You take 2 whole days to discuss just the problems, 2 whole days which discuss the solutions to them.
Marvin, so
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're a bit running out of time. We only have 13 minutes left.
Okay.
I mean, we were a bit late, I know, but we don't want to overexpend the time, and we already have questions. So maybe if you make it to come to your conclusion or speed up, then we can take some of the questions, as I see there's a great interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And then I will speed up with this. Sorry for not thinking out, but thank you for already putting this out. So what I wanted to show you clearly is that in this process, some resolutions are made. As you can see here, a resolution, for example, from the Committee of Environment, Public Health. It clearly outlines the problems and the solutions of an individual topic. Even more, these things are elementary for fighting crisis and then making sure that young people understand that they also have to lobby for the vision of Europe they want to talk about. So here, for example, we have been creating the vision for climate policy and energy, which obviously also interacts at great length with the biodiversity crisis. In this, we have very strong opinions, which are very, very much supported by the different resolutions of the biggest events and also surveys we have done throughout our network. And whilst the European Youth Parliament is a great initiative, in my opinion, it's important to also look in a further scope and just realizing what the youth is doing currently. So there are countless initiatives working against the biodiversity crisis. You probably know most of them, for example, Fridays for Future or Greenpeace. And also the Global Biodiversity Youth Network is something I have come to work a great deal with. They're engaging in COPs, they're organizing local initiatives with focus on the biodiversity crisis. They're protesting, having talks, workshops, panels, discussions, you name it. It's incredibly important that young people are on the edge of doing so. And before I go to the questions, sorry for being late, I want to leave you with the 2 main messages I wanted to give away. So the first one, it's a bit harsh to say breakdown or breakthrough, but I think it is. The reality is that, in my opinion, that young people managed to put back environmental degradation in the international agenda. Without the scope of Fridays for Future or something, we would have not been in this position where we are, whilst we're still facing limited access and having still huge, enormous problems, and we're not there where we need to be. So these are a testament of how young people are able and willing to drive politics in a very scientific-based manner. As already said, educated discussions are at the center of the building blocks of what we're doing in the European Youth Parliament. Youth listens to science, and the next message is that young people are able and willing to combat the biodiversity crisis. And in this regard, I think it's long overdue that you as a scientific community and we as youth engage further in sharing our common grounds and making sure that we are both realizing this role as the amplifiers of so-called reason. And this is the last thing I want to show you. It's a call to action. I believe that a lot of these things are possible to do. So for example, from now on, realizing that you should maybe use 10% of your time that you're spending in your workplace, reaching out specifically to marginalized groups in the process, or specifically to groups which are on the edge or not realizing. So we have plenty of proposals here. I won't read them out now. But with this, I would very much like to open the floor to questions, and thank you all so much for your interest and participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marvin, and thank you also for speeding up it. We caused the problems of time in the first part. So, but I'm happy to take the questions, and I'll start right away with Katrin Rosi Wirtz. She says, Martin, how do you avoid to communicate in a social media bubble? Which is, of course, a great question, as not all the young people in Europe are as engaged as you are and your fellow colleagues.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think in this regard, it's also important to realize the whole limitations of the European Youth Parliament or any youth initiative. you have these barriers of inclusivity basically starting where you are saying, okay, you need young people to provide all of or a lot of their free time to attend one of these sessions, or one of the conferences where they're talking about biodiversity. It will only be low effort and inclusive to a full extent when you enable young people to not just do this in their volunteer and free time, which obviously is given to a certain group of young people more than to another, but to make sure that there are basically no barriers. Concerning social media, I'm convinced that this is obviously the tool to realize and interact with young people in a very, very broad extent nowadays. And therefore, I believe while still there are some as you have pointed out, some problems with not reaching all young people through social media, I still think it is the way to go. And in general, I think it's important to realize that you need to, or scientific evidence should really start in the living reality of young people, which is currently social media. So taking the step to say, okay, let's condense what we have just realized and make sure that young people can understand it and can interact with it. And that's probably social media right now, or attending conferences, or really reaching out to young opinion groups.
Sure. No, I think the question was how to not to remain in the bubble of those young people connected by social media, being interested in sustainability and a good future, but how to reach all the others.
Yeah, in this regard, I think what I've said in the first part is the inclusivity aspect obviously requires a big amount of resources, and as you probably know best, or know in your own realms, resources are very scarce and hard to get. So to engage young people over social media, or apart, and the next step from social media is definitely to reach out to some of these groups who are already working on a biodiversity crisis, or to organize specific stakeholder events for young people in this regard, or to maybe even ask that when you're invited to a plenary and discuss about biodiversity, them to also include young people, will make sure that they are multiplying also in realms which are not just social media, and with this hopefully tackling that issue.
Dr. Birte Hauser and Dr. Julian Tafner, they both want to know whether you're really heard. Birte asks, how do you take your ideas and suggestions to the old guys and let them be implemented? Which is, by the way, our question too, how to fill this implementation gap of all the huge research on biodiversity that has been done, and all the scientists here in the 3 days of the conference I've seen. Well, it has not been implemented, and the problem is getting bigger and bigger. So
Yeah.
what do you do with your young voices? How do you feel? Do you get heard?
Yeah, so I believe in this regard, a quote which you maybe have also heard before is true. If you want to walk fast, you walk alone, but if you want to walk far, you walk together. So I think going and bringing our message to real politics requires that we are working together in such a huge network. It requires that young people are fostering all of their inputs into maybe a condensed paper which has very bold claims. As you have seen, like the paper basically says, okay, get rid of 100% of fossil fuel infrastructure till 2030. And something like that. And then, of course, it's about realism and whatever, and getting down again to the ground. But I still truly believe that youth is here also to make very bold claims, and with this to hopefully wake up decision makers. And in this regard, I can only say we are trying a lot, and I think the partnership here, and I think the communication channels between biodiversity research community also interacts, or the question here interacts strongly with this. I think nowadays we are so connected that it really is just writing an email to a community or a group in your respective member state or in your respective working group, and taking the step. And I think we're doing it on a lot of our conferences to say, let's try to give the communication to other stakeholders a try as much as possible. And I don't know how to make older people listen. I just know how to talk and talk and talk and talk, and hopefully this then makes a difference.
Well, so do we. The same is our hope. Volker Moosburger just invites you to get connected. He said, "How could we build up a communication channel between biodiversity research community, FEDA, and the European Youth Parliament?" And I think that's a good offer. And maybe you have an idea right now, but otherwise you will be connected with Volker afterwards, and then let's see what comes up with this connection. But give us your ideas on this, on a steady communication line.
100%. And in this regard, I think it's important to say that the European Youth Parliament has chapters in basically 40 states which go over Europe. So whoever is watching this right now, you can reach out not only to generally the European Youth Parliament. So this is what I would encourage FEDA to do. There's an international office which coordinates all of these different parliaments and which also made this here possible, which is an extremely high honor for me. But there are also regional offices, all led by youth. So in this regard, if you reach out to them and tell them, okay, I'm interested in what you're doing. I see that we need to take this thing of biodiversity further. I am very much convinced that they will directly approach you with a proposal back. May this be a different event or organizing something on a session so that one topic is really the biodiversity crisis. So right now for FEDA, I can definitely put the offer on the table to coordinate strongly with the international network of the European Youth Parliament or with the German-based European Youth Parliament. But in this regard, also, I think it also already goes a long way if when you get invited to a conference like this, given the plural topics we're facing, that you just say yes, and that you're supporting volunteering in, may this be your students or around you, or engage with it generally yourself. Scientists for Future, for example, are always open to more people like you, and I think I'm certain that you are already really much engaged in that.
Thank you so much, Marvin. That's a great idea, and Volker has already written great thanks. And let's see about your common further engagement with Scientists for Futures and Fridays for Future, and wherever the places to fill the implementation gap. Thank you so much for your inspiration at the closing of the conference, and you were invited to stay with us for the next half hour, also for the networking carousel. So maybe you need other interesting people who inspire you further. So thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for your engagement, first of all, which is a lot of time. Thank you.